shattered souls. The dim light of the sun filtered through the thick clouds as the Levi family's old station wagon rumbled down the deserted dirt road. The village of Einar lay ahead, shrouded in an eerie stillness that made Rachel Levi clutch her husband Daniel's arm a little tighter. "Are you sure about this?" Rachel asked softly, her voice barely audible over the engine's hum. Daniel nodded, his eyes fixed on the thin road that lay ahead. "This is a new start for all of us, Rachel. Einar may look little, but it's cheap and it's ours." In the back seat, 12-year-old Hannah stared out the window, her hazel eyes following the dark forest, closing in on them. Beside her, her older brother Yosef's face was buried in his book, unaware of how his sister felt about their heir. The Levis were running from a past of sorrow. Daniel, who had been a successful teacher, had lost his job and reputation under unexplained circumstances. Rachel spent sleepless nights worrying about dwindling finances and an uncertain future for their children. Einar, with its quiet promise of affordability, looked like salvation. But as the car rolled into the village, the atmosphere shifted. The air grew heavier, colder. The houses, though quaint and rustic, bore an unsettling air of neglect. Shutters hung askew, windows were caked with grime, and the streets were devoid of any signs of life. "Where is everyone?" Hannah asked, her voice trembling. Daniel forced a smile. "Probably inside, staying warm. It's colder here in the mountains." But even he couldn't shake the unease prickling at the back of his neck. The new house of the Levi family stood on the outskirts of the village, with a faded red roof hardly visible behind the overgrowth. The house was old, its walls covered with ivy, and the wooden porch creaked under their weight as they stepped inside. "This is cozy," Rachel said hesitantly, running her fingers over the dust-coated mantelpiece. Hannah wrinkled her nose. "It smells like something died in here." "Don't be dramatic," Yosef muttered. But he checked the corners immediately, his heart beating fast enough that it almost sounded like he was running. As the family began to unpack, a knock echoed through the empty halls. It was slow, deliberate, almost hesitant. Daniel opened the door to find an elderly man standing on the porch. His face was deeply lined, and his pale blue eyes held a mixture of pity and fear. "You're the new folks," the man said. "Yes," Daniel replied, extending a hand. "I'm Daniel Levi. This is my family." The old man didn't take his hand. He looked instead over Daniel's shoulder at the house, his lips pushing into a thin line. "Leave," he said finally. Daniel blinked. "Excuse me?" "Leave this place," the man repeated. "Einar isn't for your kind. It isn't for anyone anymore." Before Daniel could respond, the man turned and shuffled away, his cane tapping against the cobblestones. "What was that about?" Rachel asked, stepping onto the porch. "Nothing," Daniel said, though his fingers tightened around the doorframe. "Just an old strange man. Don't mind him." That night, settling into the new house, the silence of the village seemed oppressive. Outside, the wind moaned through the trees and the old house creaked, seeming to breathe. Rachel woke in the middle of the night to a faint sound, like whispers carried on the wind. She sat up with her heart racing. "Daniel, do you hear that?" she whispered. Daniel stirred, his face groggy. "Hear what?" "The whispers," Rachel said. "It's coming from outside." Daniel listened for a moment, but heard nothing. "It's just the wind," he mumbled, pulling the blanket over his head. But Rachel was not convinced. She got out of bed and moved towards the window. The moonlight cast long shadows across the yard, and for a moment, she thought she saw a figure standing near the edge of the forest. When she blinked, it was gone. The next morning, Daniel decided to explore the village. He took Yosef along, hoping to bond with his son while getting a lay of the land. The village square was as empty as it had been the day before. Shops were boarded up, their signs faded with age. A church stood at the far end, its bell tower leaning precariously. Inside the church, Daniel and Yosef found an altar covered in dust. But what caught their attention were the markings on the walls, ancient symbols etched deep into the stone, interwoven with Hebrew phrases. "What does it mean, Abba?" Yosef asked, running his fingers over the carvings. Daniel shook his head, his brows furrowed. "I don't know. It's old." One phrase, in particular, stood out: shattered souls. As Daniel and Yosef wandered off to look around, Rachel and Hannah stayed home to clean the house. Rachel scrubbed the kitchen floor as Hannah went into the backyard and noticed an old well covered with moss. She looked into it, thinking she was going to see water. But instead of seeing water, she saw darkness, an apparent hole that seemed to go on forever. "Hannah." The voice was gentle, almost like music. Hannah turned to see no one there. "Hannah, come closer." Her feet moved of their own accord, creeping toward the well's edge. She bent forward, breath catching as if a cold hand swept her cheek. "Hannah." Rachel's voice shattered the trance. She yanked her daughter's arm, pulling her back. "What were you doing?" Rachel demanded, her voice shaking with emotion. I heard someone call my name," Hannah said, her eyes wide with fear. "There's no one here," Rachel said, though she couldn't conceal the quiver in her voice. As the family sat down to dinner that evening, the air in the house grew thick. Shadows in the corners seemed to reach out and twist, and the faint whispering came back. After dinner, Hannah went to her room, but moments later, terrified screams echoed through the house. Daniel and Rachel ran upstairs and found her door locked. "Hannah, open the door!" Daniel yelled, his fists pounding against the wood. "I can't," Hannah sobbed. "It won't open." The door suddenly swung open on its own, revealing Hannah crouched in the corner, her face pale as a sheet. "It was them," she whispered. "They don't want us here." As the family huddled together that night, Daniel finally admitted what he hadn't wanted to believe. Something was deeply wrong with Einar. Rachel held Hannah close, her eyes darting to the shadows that seemed to dance across the walls. Yosef sat silently, his book forgotten, as the whispers grew louder. And outside, the forest loomed, its trees swaying as if alive, as if watching. The Levi family spent the night huddled together in the living room, the oppressive silence of the village wrapping around them like a shroud. The whispers that had plagued their first evening in Einar had not stopped. They ebbed and flowed like a tide, too faint to make out but too persistent to ignore. By morning, exhaustion etched itself on everyone's face. Rachel barely touched her breakfast, her gaze darting toward the windows as if expecting something, or someone, to appear. Yosef, usually brimming with curiosity, stared blankly at his plate, his mind replaying the sounds of his sister's cries. Daniel, however, seemed determined to keep things moving. "Today we're going to get some answers," he said, his tone firm. Hannah, sitting closest to her mother, whispered, "I don't want to stay here." Daniel looked at his daughter, guilt flashing in his eyes. "It's just an old house, Hannah. Old places have their quirks. We'll figure it out." But deep down, even he wasn't so sure. After breakfast, Daniel decided to investigate the backyard. The well that had drawn Hannah the day before seemed like a logical place to start. He stood there, peering into the hole with a flashlight. It was absolute darkness inside, and he caught a whiff of damp earth. No water was visible, only an odd stillness that made his neck hairs rise. "What do you think is down there?" Yosef asked, standing a few feet away. "Probably nothing," Daniel replied, though his voice lacked conviction. He dropped a small pebble into the well, straining to hear it hit the bottom. Nothing. The silence was unnatural. "Yosef," Daniel said, turning to his son, Keep an eye on your sister and mother. I'll be back in a bit." "Where are you going?" "To the church. I need to understand what those markings mean." The village square was as unvibrant as the last time. The only sound was the crunch of Daniel's boots on the cobblestones. Daniel came to the church, a long shadow from its leaning tower crossing the courtyard. Inside, the air was chill and damp. Dust motes drifted in the slivers of light that came in through the broken stained glass windows. The scrawls on the walls seemed darker now, as if they had been seared into the stone. Daniel's mind focused on the words that had run through him since yesterday. Shattered souls. "What does it mean?" he whispered to himself. "It means you should get out." Daniel turned around to see the old man of the previous day standing in the doorway, his face contorted with anger and fear. "What are you doing here?" Daniel demanded. "I said you should leave. You didn't listen," he replied. Daniel stepped forward, his frustration boiling over. "I am not leaving until I know what's going on. What happened here? Why is this place abandoned?" The old man sighed, his shoulders drooping. "Einar was once a thriving village," he said in a low voice. "But something happened years ago. Something that should never have been disturbed. The well. It's not just a well. It's a doorway." "A doorway to what?" The man's eyes bored into Daniel's. "To them. To the ones who are trapped." Rachel tidied the house, with Hannah in her room playing quietly. Yosef sat in the living room, flipping through a book, unable to actually read. A knock at the window made Hannah freeze. She turned slowly, her heart pounding. Outside, a woman stood in the yard, her face pale and eyes unnaturally bright. Hannah felt an inexplicable pull and went to the window. The woman smiled, beckoning her with one finger. "Hannah!" Rachel's voice broke the spell. Hannah turned, her face pale. "There's someone outside." Rachel rushed to the window, but the yard was empty. "Hannah, there's no one there," Rachel said, though her voice shook. "But I saw her," Hannah insisted. "She wanted me to come outside." Rachel hugged her daughter close. "Stay away from the windows." Back at the church, the old man told them of Einar's history. "Long, long ago," he started, "the villagers found the well. It was deeper than any well they had ever seen. But instead of water, they found something else. A presence. It was subtle at first, strange noises, shadows moving on their own. And then people started to vanish." Daniel listened intently to the weight of the man's words sinking in. "The villagers tried to seal the well," he continued, "but it was too late. The darkness had already taken root. It fed on their fears, their sorrows. It shattered them." "And the markings in the church?" Daniel asked. "Wards," the man replied. "They were meant to keep the darkness contained, but they're weakening." That evening, as the family sat down to dinner, the house became heavy with atmosphere. Shadows in the corners seemed darker, and the air thickened. "I think we should leave," Rachel said finally, breaking the silence. Daniel shook his head. "We can't, not yet. There's something we need to understand first." But his resolve was weakening when the door to the kitchen slammed shut on its own. "What was that?" Yosef asked, his voice trembling. Daniel dashed to the door, but it wouldn't open. He pressed harder with his palms. They were wet. Finally, the door swung open, and an empty room greeted him. Rachel clutched Hannah, her eyes wide with fear. "Daniel, please, we have to go." That night, Daniel couldn't sleep. He stepped outside for some air. The village was cloaked in darkness, lit only by the moon above. He was attracted to the forest, the trees swaying in the night breeze. He walked toward it, and the whispers resumed. Soft, indistinct, but undeniably real. "Who's there?" he called, his voice carrying through the trees. No answer. But as he turned to go, he saw it. A figure standing just beyond the tree line, its eyes glowing faintly in the dark. Daniel ran back into the house, his heart thudding. He did not say anything to Rachel about what he had seen. He didn't want to frighten her further. But he could not stop the feeling that they were being watched. As the family slept, the whispers grew louder, filling the house with a sinister hum. Outside, the forest seemed to inch closer, its shadows stretching toward the house like hungry fingers. And down in the well, something stirred. The second night in Einar was anything but peaceful for the Levi family. Whispers crawled through the house like living things, brushing against their ears in the silence of the night. The forest outside seemed to breathe, its shadows creeping closer to the house. Everyone looked worse for wear by morning. Rachel's eyes were rimmed red with lack of sleep. Yosef was pale and jittery, and even young Hannah seemed subdued. But the weight lay with Daniel. The figure he had seen in the woods haunted his thoughts. The tension within the family was palpable, and it seemed that the house feeds on it. Every floorboard creaked and lights flickered as if the walls themselves were alive. It started over breakfast. While Rachel set plates on the table, she saw a salt shaker roll unnaturally across the surface, stopping and stopping in front of Hannah. "What is this?" Rachel whispered, her voice trembling. Daniel tried to dismiss it. "It's an old house. Maybe the table isn't level." Then there was the knock. 3 sharp, deliberate raps on the front door. Daniel got to his feet, his heart hammering. He opened the door, but the yard was empty, save for the well in the distance. "Who's there?" he yelled, but the only reply came from the wind rustling. He turned back to the family and found Yosef's face white. "Dad," the whispers, "they're getting louder." Later that afternoon, Yosef decided to snoop around by himself. Carrying a flashlight and a notebook, he stepped out into the backyard as his parents busied themselves debating whether they should leave the village. He approached the well, his heart pounding within him. The whispers grew louder as he edged toward it, a chilling symphony of fragmented voices. "Help us," one of them murmured. "Yosef," came another, softer, even intimate. He was froze, gripping the well rim. "Who's here?" he whispered into the darkness. The light illuminated the dark interior. Still, there was nothing, only the endless abyss of well. Then, something shifted. A faint shadow, too indistinct to be human, shifted deep within the well. Yosef stumbled back, dropping his flashlight. When he retrieved it and pointed it into the well again, the shadow was gone. Within the house, Rachel swept and mopped, hungry for a semblance of normalcy. But the whispers followed her, taunting her with words she couldn't quite understand. As she wiped the kitchen counter, she caught a glimpse of something in the corner of her eye, a pale figure standing just outside the window. Rachel gasped, spinning around, but the yard was empty. "Daniel!" she screamed, clutching the counter for support. Daniel rushed in, his face drawn with concern. "What happened?" "I saw someone outside the window." Daniel glanced outside but saw nothing unusual. "Rachel, you're exhausted. You haven't slept." "I know what I saw, Daniel," she snapped. "There's something out there. Something watching us." That evening, as the family prepared for bed, Hannah asked a question that sent a chill through the room. "Why is the door upstairs locked?" Daniel frowned. "What door?" "The one at the end of the hall," Hannah said. "I tried to open it, but it wouldn't budge." Rachel exchanged a worried glance with Daniel. "I didn't know there was another room up there." "I'll check it out," Daniel said, grabbing a flashlight. The door in question was indeed locked, its old wooden surface scratched and weathered. Daniel tried the handle, but it wouldn't move. "Maybe it's just stuck," he said, though he felt a strange unease creeping over him. As he turned to go away, a dull thud sounded from behind the door. The knock came again that night, but this time it wasn't at the door. It was at the window of the living room. Daniel took a fire poker and moved cautiously towards it. Outside, a man stood in the yard, his face masked by shadows. "Who are you?" Daniel asked him, his voice firm. The man moved closer, coming into the light. He was gaunt with hollow eyes and a pallor almost not human. "You shouldn't be here," the man whispered, raspy with his voice. "Who are you?" Daniel repeated. "Go away," the man urged, urgency in his voice, "before it is too late." Daniel wasn't even able to ask anything because the man went in and walked toward the forest and then disappeared into shadows. Hannah's shriek had woken the family in the middle of the night. Daniel and Rachel came running to her bedroom to find her sitting straight in bed, wide-eyed with terror. "She was here," Hannah wailed. "The lady in the yard. She was here." Rachel clung to her daughter tightly in a bid to soothe her. "It's just a bad dream, darling." But Hannah shook her head. "She told me to follow her. She said she'd show me what's inside the well." Daniel felt a chill run down his spine. "We're leaving tomorrow," he said firmly. As the family tried to sleep, the whispers grew louder, filling every corner of the house. Shadows seemed to stretch and move on their own, and the oppressive atmosphere made it hard to breathe. Daniel sat awake, his tight grip on the fire poker. It was past midnight. He heard it, the sound of footsteps outside. He peered out the window and saw them, moving figures in the forest whose forms barely told from shadows. And then, one by one, they looked at the house. The Levi family had made up their minds to leave Einar, but the house and the village seemed in no mood to let them. Daniel started packing in the morning light, as the frost on the ground refused to be touched. Whispers, though very silent in the daytime, did seem to linger in the hollows of the house to mock their hurry. Rachel tried to keep herself engaged, busied, but every creak of the floorboards and every rustle of the wind outside did feel deliberate, calculated, as if unseen eyes were watching every move they made. As the family prepared to leave, dark clouds rolled in unnaturally fast, shrouding the village in oppressive gloom. The wind screamed like a wounded animal, and rain began pouring down in thick sheets, which prevented loading the car. "This storm wasn't forecasted," Rachel said, her voice tight with unease as she peered out of the window. "It's just a delay," Daniel replied, though his confidence wavered. "We'll leave as soon as it clears." But deep down, he felt the storm was no accident. While the family waited, Yosef's curiosity got the better of him. He couldn't stop thinking about the locked door upstairs. Something about it felt wrong, as though it was hiding a truth they weren't meant to uncover. He crept upstairs, his flashlight in hand, standing before the door. In a shock, the handle turned easily this time, as if the door had unlocked for him just then. Inside, the room was small and bare, but there were strange symbols and writings covering the walls, etched deep into the wood. There was an old wooden box in the center of the room, its lid partially ajar. Yosef hesitated before entering. His breath fogged in the chill air as he knelt to examine the box. Inside was a collection of aged photographs and a rusted locket. The photographs were faded, but one image caught his attention. A family standing in front of the same house. Their faces looked eerily like his family's. "What is this?" Yosef whispered, his hands shaking. Before he could investigate more, a voice whispered softly, chillingly behind his back. "You shouldn't be here." He spun around, but nobody was there. Down in the house, Rachel could feel a sense of heavy foreboding. She attempted to push it aside to keep busy with their packing, but it grew stronger, even feeling like a weight inside her chest. She kept moving towards the living room, and then found a flickering glow, which was present coming from the mirror above the fireplace. Curious yet frightened, she moved towards the mirror. First, nothing unusual was reflected in it, but then the image started to change. She reflected and saw the living room, but it was darker, decayed, as if abandoned for years. Shadows moved unnaturally in the corners, and a figure stood in the middle of the room, her own reflection, but with hollow eyes and a twisted smile. Rachel stumbled back with a scream, knocking over a vase. The sound brought Daniel running. "What happened?" he asked, grabbing her shoulders. "The mirror. It showed me something. Something wrong," she stammered, tears streaming down her face. Daniel glanced at the mirror, but it reflected only the room as it was. "You're stressed, Rachel," he said, though his own unease was evident. "We'll be out of here soon." As night fell, the storm outside intensified. The rain hammered against the windows, and the wind howled like a banshee. The family huddled together in the living room, trying to ignore the oppressive atmosphere. Then came the knock. This time, it was at the back door. Daniel grabbed the fire poker again and cautiously approached. When he opened the door, the stranger from the previous night was there, drenched but calm. "You haven't left," the man said, his voice flat. "We're trying," Daniel replied, his frustration evident. "The storm, it won't let you," the man interrupted, stepping inside uninvited. Rachel gasped, pulling Hannah close. "Who are you?" The man ignored the question. "The house doesn't want you to leave. It has chosen you." "Chosen us for what?" Daniel demanded. "To finish what was started," the man said cryptically. "But you must be careful. The well, it's not what it seems." Before Daniel could ask for more answers, the man turned and walked back into the storm, disappearing in the darkness. The electricity went out just after midnight, and the house sank into darkness. The whispering returned, louder now, and the shadows seemed alive, writhing before her. Rachel lit candles whose flickering light cast surreal shapes on the walls. "Where's Hannah?" she asked suddenly, her voice trembling. Panic gripped them as they realized that little Hannah was gone. "She was just here," Rachel cried, tears falling from her face. Daniel took a flashlight and went through the house. "Hannah, where are you?" The whispers taunted him, growing louder as he searched. He found her in the backyard, standing at the edge of the well, with a blank face and her eyes unblinking. "Hannah!" Daniel yelled, running to her. She turned to him slowly, her voice hollow. "She's calling me Daddy. She says I belong with her." Daniel grabbed her, pulling her away from the well. "No one's calling you, sweetheart. It's just your imagination." But as he carried her back to the house, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching them from the well. As the night wore on, the family began to fray. Rachel became irrational. Yosef began obsessing over the photos and symbols he had managed to find, and Daniel fought to keep everything contained. The whispers took them to the edge of sanity as they pulled deeper into the house's sinister grip. Once, Yosef found a diary tucked away under an unlocked floorboard in the locked room. It was the family in the photograph's diary, chronicling their progression into madness. The last page read, "The well is the key, but at too great a cost. We leave while we still can." But they never left. The storm outside had reached its peak, the fury now a howl of desperate, unrelenting wind. The house, now just a hollow shell, seemed to groan and creak as if it was alive, and somebody, was trying to push his way in. The once full of hope Levi family was drowning in despair. Daniel stood by the window, staring into the pitch-black darkness. The rain pounded on the glass like icy needles. Trees outside bent violently in the wind. A sharp crack cut through the house like a scream, as if something had broken. His heart was racing. He turned to Rachel, who clutched Hannah in her arms in the corner of the room, her face white with fear. "I've been thinking," Daniel said, his voice shaking despite his best efforts to remain calm. "There's something we've missed. Something we need to understand about this place." Rachel met his gaze, her eyes filled with fear. "I don't care what it is, Daniel. We just need to leave. Now." But Daniel felt the crushing weight of the house, the village, on top of them. He felt a sense in his gut that they wouldn't leave unless they grasped what was happening, that they needed to unlock the final secret of the well. Yosef, his mind unraveling at the tension, stumbled down the narrow hall toward the attic, the floorboards creaking beneath his feet, as if the house was whispering to him. He reached the door to the attic, which had always been locked, and found it ajar. His breath caught in his throat. A peculiarity of warmth inside the house, although cold everywhere. A very big, large, ornate mirror stood majestically at the center of the room, reflecting the dirt and grime of time in its dark spots. Yosef kept staring into his reflection with those eyes. For a fraction of a moment, a strange pull arose. A something didn't seem right. That wasn't him staring. The face in the mirror was older, twisted by pain, and remarkably familiar. It had the same features as his, but was hollow-eyed and wretchedly contorted into agony. Then a low and raspy voice whispered in reply from within the mirror, "You should never have come back." Yosef stumbled back, his hands shaking as his mind reeled. What was it? Why was it showing him this? His own face. The mirror seemed to pulse with unnatural energy, and the floor beneath his feet seemed to vibrate. Meanwhile, Rachel started rummaging through the old photographs in the living room. What was once nostalgic now looked like warning signs, taunting them for their ignorance. There was one photograph that caught her eye, a family portrait, clearly taken years ago. The faces of the parents and children stared back at her, but something was wrong. The eyes were blank, lifeless. She felt a wave of nausea wash over her as she recognized the familiar faces in the photograph. They were her family. This was their house. The realization hit her like a punch to the stomach. "No," she whispered, backing away from the photograph. "No, this can't be. This can't be real." But it was. It was her family, the Levi family, the same one that had disappeared decades ago, the same one whose souls were stuck in this place, unable to go on. Rachel's heart started racing as pieces of the puzzle fell into place. Outside, the wind howled through the night like a beast, but Rachel could not tear her eyes from the photograph. The truth was undeniable now. The house, the village, and the well, they were all connected, and the souls that had vanished in the past had never really left. They were waiting for someone to take their place. She turned to Daniel, her face pale with fear. "Daniel," she gasped, "we have to stop. We can't go until we know what has happened to them. What has happened to us?" But just as she did, the door crashed open, and there stood Yosef, his face deathly pale and sweaty-looking, eyes wide with horror. "They're not gone," he panted. "They're still here. They're in the well, and they want us to join them." The family stood together, gathered in the dimly lit living room. The wind outside had reached a deafening pitch, and the house seemed to groan under its pressure. Each creak and crack was an echo from another time, another world. At this point, the house, alive with whispers and shadows, was at its peak. "We have to go to the well," Daniel said, his voice grim. Rachel shook her head, tears forming in her eyes. "No, Daniel. If we go to the well, we will never return. We'll be here forever." The compulsion was irresistible, however. They had to face it. They had to face whatever it was that had tied them to this place. The curse, the spirits. They could not leave until they faced the truth. They went out into the storm. The air was thick with fog, and the trees bent under the force of the wind. The well, standing at the center of the yard, was a dark, looming presence in the distance. Its mouth gaped open, as if calling them to its depths. "Whatever happens," Daniel said, "we stay together." As they approached the well, a strange calm settled over the family. The storm seemed to still, the winds died down, and the oppressive weight of the house lifted, if only for a moment. The whispers, however, grew louder, filling the air with a deafening cacophony of voices. They were here, all around them. They stood by the edge of the well. The air stank of rot, and worse than that, something deeper and darker. The well itself seemed to pulse as though it had a living, breathing quality, its darkness boundless and deep. Then out of it rose a figure, twisted and grotesque, yet somehow all too familiar. It was the stranger who had earlier come to warn them. "You shouldn't have come," he rasped, his voice like some sick animal. "You brought them back." And the ground underneath their feet quaked with an uprising series of visions which overwhelmed their sight and ears. There was a well, which bound it with a history that lasted over generations in curses, while house, village, where families used to settle for centuries, all those were a family bound in a bond with each successive family, attracted by this darkness. "You are a part of it now," he said faintly over the growing whispering. Rachel screamed as the figure lunged forward, his hand outstretched to pull them into the depths of the well. However, before he could even reach them, the earth beneath him opened wide and swallowed him up. In that moment, the whispers ceased, the storm stopped, and the world became quiet. The Levi family has never left Einar. Some say that their souls were consumed by the well, while others whisper and say that they became the house, stuck in eternal darkness. The house is there, the village is still there, and the well is still there, holding on to its secrets, hiding them until the next discovers them. But one thing is sure, the Levi family was not the first casualty of the well's curse, and they will certainly not be the last.